In my previous video, I discussed the theory development in leadership research before the 1950s. The great man theory had given way to trait theory, and trait theory had promised to put leadership science on empirical ground. But as we saw, Ralph Stogdill's landmark 1948 review of 124 trait studies found no consistent profile that reliably differentiated leaders from non-leaders across situations. We also saw that the field of educational administration had arrived at the threshold of the 1950s with no theoretical foundation at all. Its knowledge base built almost entirely from practitioners' anecdotes and common sense wisdom. If you have not yet watched that video, I encourage you to do so before continuing here, because everything we cover today builds directly on that foundation. In my previous video, I introduced the broad social forces that put leadership research on a scientific trajectory in the first half of the 20th century. Those social forces were industrialization, the Great Depression, World War II, the growth of business schools, and the emerging influence of psychology and sociology on organizational study. Let's focus on the forces that were specifically new in the 1950s. The Cold War introduced a dimension of ideological urgency that the previous decade had not carried in the same way. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in competition that was much about the systems of organization as it was about military capacity. Each claimed that its system produced superior outcomes. In this context, the effectiveness of organizations and of the leaders who run them acquired geopolitical importance. Research that could identify what made leaders and organizations effective was not just academically interesting, it also served national purpose. The Sputnik moment crystallized this pressure in 1957. When the Soviet Union became the first nation to place a satellite in Earth orbit, the United States experienced a wave of institutional alarm. Congress responded within a year with the National Defense Education Act of 1958. Which directed more than $1 billion into public school science and mathematics curricula. The consequence for educational leadership was immediate and profound. Suddenly, the quality of school administration was a matter of national security. This pressure accelerated the demand for scientifically grounded theory of educational leadership, a demand that the field of educational leadership was entirely unprepared to meet. The philosophy of science also shaped this era in ways the previous decade had only begun to establish. By mid-century, logical positivism had become the governing framework for how social scientists thought about legitimate knowledge. The core commitment was to empirical observation, systematic measurement, and hypothesis testing. Karl Popper's insistence on falsifiability and Robert Merton's concept of mid-range theory shaped how leadership researchers define their goals. Unlike grand theories that make sweeping narratives, mid-range theories call for limited scope and empirically testable propositions. Researchers invested heavily in psychometric tools, survey instruments, and experimental designs, and they expected their theory to generate testable predictions. The institutional infrastructure of the field of leadership was also expanding. The Academy of Management Journal was established in 1958. It created a dedicated venue for management research. The journal Human Relations had published its first 10 volumes between 1947 and 1956, capturing much of the decade's group dynamics scholarship. Those venues gave scholars both an audience and a set of disciplinary standards that reinforce the positivist orientation. Taken together, the Cold War urgency, the Sputnik shock to education, the positivist philosophy of science, and the maturing institutional infrastructure created conditions for an unusually fertile decade of theory development. In my previous video, I discussed the core problem that the 1950s inherited. Stogdill's review had demonstrated that no consistent trait profile reliably differentiated effective leaders from ineffective ones across situations. That finding did not kill trait theory immediately. Through the early 1950s, scholars continued producing reviews suggesting that a handful of traits, particularly intelligence, showed some consistency. Their efforts suggest that the problem was not that traits were entirely irrelevant. It was that researchers had been seeking universal predictors without attending to the situation in which leaders actually operated. The decisive intellectual move of the 1950s was to redirect the central research question entirely. Instead of asking, what kind of a person is the effective leader, researchers began asking, what does the effective leaders do? In my previous video, I traced the earliest stirrings of this behavioral term. Lewin, Likert, and White's 1939 experiment on authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire leadership styles had shown that behavior, not just personality, produced measurable differences in group outcomes. But that experiment was a single demonstration. It was not cumulative research evidence. What the 1950s provided was the institutional scale and methodological sophistication to build that line of research systematically. Two major research programs drove that shift. At Ohio State University, a team of researchers under Ralph Stogdill's guidance set out to identify the behavioral dimensions that distinguished effective from ineffective leaders. They did this empirically. They collected descriptions of leader behavior from subordinates across military, industrial, and educational settings, and then used factor analysis to identify patterns. Factor analysis was a relatively new statistical technique at the time. The result was a two-dimensional model. The first dimension, which researchers named consideration, it captured relationship-oriented behaviors, such as showing concerns for subordinates, building trust, treating people with warmth and respect. The second dimension, which they named initiating structure, captured task-oriented behaviors. For example, defining roles, assigning tasks, organizing the work, and setting goals. This two-dimensional model reduced the almost infinite complexity of leadership behavior to a manageable theoretical structure. It was empirically derived instead of being armchair theorized. And importantly, it was replicated across very different organizational settings, which gave it a generalizability that trait theory findings had lacked. The team operationalized these dimensions in the Leader Behavior Description Questionnaire, known as the LBDQ, which became one of the most widely used instruments in leadership research. At the University of Michigan, Rances Likert and his colleagues arrived at a parallel conclusion through a different research path. Their studies of supervisors in industrial settings found that high-performing departments tended to have supervisors who were employee-centered, who focused on building relationships and creating a supportive atmosphere, as opposed to job-centered supervisors who focused narrowly on production quotas. The language is different from the Ohio State University's findings, but the underlying finding was strikingly similar. Leaders who attend to both the task demands and the human needs of their followers achieve better outcomes. As more behavioral studies accumulated through the mid to late 1950s, a problem emerged. The findings were not consistent. What was going on? It gradually became clear that situational factors were moderating the effects of leader behavior. By the late 1950s, researchers were confronting what would become one of the field's most important insights. There is no one best style of leadership for all situations. The scholar who did the most systemic early work in this direction was Fred Fiedler. In the late 1950s, Fiedler was developing a measure he called the least preferred coworker scale, which asked leaders to describe the person they had least enjoyed working with. Leaders who described that person in relatively positive terms tended to be relationship motivated. Those who described the person harshly tended to be task motivated. Fiedler then gathered data across different organizational contexts, and found that which style produced better outcomes depended on what he called situational favorableness. It was a combination of leader-member relations, task structure, and the leader's formal position power. Task-motivated leaders performed best in situations that were either very favorable or very unfavorable. Relationship-motivated leaders performed best in situations of intermediate favorability. Fiedler's full model would not be published until 1964, but the data he was collecting in the late 50s provided the empirical foundation. His work marked a clear shift. The effectiveness of a leader's style is not a fixed property of that style, but the result of its interaction with situational demands. Douglas McGregor's contribution also belongs to this contingency thinking. McGregor developed his Theory X and Theory Y in the late 1950s and published them formally in 1960. Theory X represented a set of assumptions that workers are inherently lazy, that they resist responsibility, that they must be controlled through directive management. Theory Y represented an alternative set of assumptions that people can find work meaningful, that they seek responsibility under the right conditions, that participative leadership can unlock intrinsic motivation. McGregor argued that management practices follow from these underlying assumptions, and that leaders who hold Theory X assumptions will manage very differently from those who hold Theory Y assumptions, regardless of any universal behavioral prescription. In this sense, Theory X and Theory Y introduce an important dimension that the behavioral paradigm had neglected. By the close of the 1950s, the field had moved toward what would become the contingency thinking of the 1960s, the intellectual problem of inconsistent effects that behavioral researchers had encountered was a signal pointing toward the next stage of theory development. So far, we've been tracing leadership research, which was primarily rooted in industrial and organizational psychology. But a parallel and equally significant revolution was unfolding in the subfield of educational administration. In my previous video, I closed with a sobering assessment. Educational administration lacked a well-defined body of knowledge, was devoid of elegant theoretical foundation. As the dissatisfaction with this state of affairs grew, logical positivism became more influential in the social sciences, and the post-Sputnik push to improve education intensified. Together, these forces led scholars to deliberately build educational administration as a scientific discipline. The theory movement in educational administration is typically dated from around 1954. At the National Council of Professors of Educational Administration meeting in that year, a group of scholars that included Daniel Griffiths, Andrew Halpin, Jacob Getzels initiated a systematic effort to bring theory to educational administration professorate. The goal was to develop a cumulative, generalizable knowledge base for educational leadership through rigorous hypothetical deductive empirical research. Daniel Griffiths became the most influential architect of this transformation. Born in 1917, Griffiths earned his doctorate from Yale in 1952 and later became the dean of New York University School of Education. In 1957, he published Administrative Theory, one of the first books to systematically apply organizational theory to school administration. Griffiths drew on the work of Chas Barnett and Herbert Simon to reframe school leadership as a form of organizational decision-making, and he set demanding standards for what would count as legitimate theory in the field. A theoretical construct was not sufficient. What was needed was systems of interrelated propositions capable of generating testable hypotheses. A construct is like a stone. A theory is like a house. A pile of stones is not a house. The University Council for Educational Administration, UCEA, was founded in 1954 with the support from the Kellogg Foundation. UCEA provided the institutional infrastructure for the theory movement. UCEA's explicit mission was to shift educational administration from anecdotal orientation from a more scientific one to extend the use of more effective methods of inquiry and to foster the development of generalizable knowledge about leadership and organization. This was, in fact, a declaration that educational administration would become a scholarly discipline instead of practitioners' anecdotes and personal experience. The theory movement drew heavily on theoretical foundations from the broader social sciences. Ohio State's leadership research was imported directly into educational settings. Andrew Halpin adapted the LBDQ for use with school principals. Halpin's subsequent research on organizational climate was published fully in 1963 with Kraft. They use teacher questionnaires to classify schools according to interpersonal atmosphere they maintained and found that school climate correlated with the principal's behavior on both consideration and initiating structure dimensions. The behavioral theory of leadership developed initially in industrial settings proved transportable to schools. Perhaps the most theoretically native development in educational administration during this period was the social system model proposed by Jacob Getzels and Guba in 1957. Their model conceptualized the school as a social system in which administration works on the continuous management of two interacting dimensions, the institutional dimension, which includes formal roles and role expectations, and the individual dimension, the personal needs and disposition of people who occupy those roles. Effective school leadership requires the ability to balance role demands with individual needs. The theory development has its tensions. Some practitioners and traditional professors found new emphasis on the theory too abstract. There was a fracture between those who championed the scientific positivist approach and those who remained committed to practical wisdom grounded in personal experience. UCEA represented the former. The National Council of Professors of Educational Administration, with its stronger practitioner orientation, represented the latter. This divide between the scientific and the practitioner cultures in educational administration would persist for decades, and it remains a recognized tension in the field of educational leadership till this day. In the next video of this series of theory development of leadership research, we'll move into the 1960s when the contingency theory of leadership came fully into its own. We'll examine Fiedler's complete contingency theory, the emergence of path goal theory, and the development of situational leadership models. We'll also see how the theory development in educational administration matured and how the field began to confront the tension between its positivist aspirations and the irreducibly value-laden character of leading schools. The 1950s built the intellectual architecture. The 1960s would test it.